Welcome to Make Your Mark podcast, where guests share their experiences, insights, and tactics to help you accelerate your business. So building, scaling, and monetizing your business is made easier. And I will be your host, Kay Suthar. Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Make Your Mark podcast. And oh boy, am I super excited for this episode. Why? Because we have one of the podcasting legends on this episode, and he's going to be telling us a little bit about what he was doing before, how he got involved in podcasting, and where he sees podcasting going. What is the future of podcasting? So I'm going to leave it at that, guys, because I'm going to let Dave Jackson, one of the legends in podcasting, introduce himself and tell us a little bit about podcasting and how this all came about. Oh my God, Dave, I am super excited to have you on this show.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. This is going to be fun. Yeah, I'm Dave Jackson. I've been podcasting since 2005, so I will celebrate 19 years next month. And back then I took a blog that I'd been doing for musicians, and a friend of mine came back from this big marketing conference and he said, hey, again, this dates me. I'd missed the whole MySpace boat. He said, you know how you missed MySpace? I'm like, yeah, don't rub it in. He's like, the next big thing is going to be podcasting. And I said, what? And he goes, it's like this internet radio thing. And I Googled it and there was 1.5 pages. That was it. And I said, how do you spell it again? It's like P-O-D-C. And I'm like, I think we broke the internet. Like, there's nothing on this. And so I took what little pages there were and I put one together, and I took that blog and turned it into a podcast. And immediately I had somebody say, oh, this is cool. You went from being words on a page to a person. And I was like, oh, that's cool. And then shortly thereafter, probably 2 weeks, I got a voicemail, and I'm in the middle of nowhere, Ohio. And I got a voicemail from Michael Van Laar from Nuremberg, Germany. And I remember hitting play because it was for musicians. So they knew how to record. And I hear, hello, Dave, this is Michael Van Laar from Nuremberg. And I started, 2004 was a great year. I'd gone through a divorce, a bankruptcy, and I was living in my brother's basement. I'm starting a podcast next to the water heater. I've got a flush pipe behind me, praying that nobody flushes the toilet while I'm, podcasting. And you start where you are, right, with what you got. And this guy's like, I discovered your show and I liked it. And I was like, wait a minute, I know it's global. It's not a radio thing where you're only as strong as your signal. But there's a dude on the other side of the planet that found my show and liked it. And I just grabbed my flag and I'm like, I claim podcasting in the name of Dave. I'm like, this is my jam. Because it was kind of technical back then. You had to kind of be a geek. I could help people, which scratches my teacher's itch. I taught a ton of Microsoft Office and QuickBooks and customer service in the corporate world for years. I used to teach people how to surf the internet. That's how long I've been doing it.
No way. Oh my God.
How to send email. Yeah. And it's super creative. So I'm a musician. So it scratched every itch I had. And then at that point, after going through the divorce and the bankruptcy, I also lost my job. And so I was like, okay, I need money to go back to school. So I went back to school. I got a teaching degree, but I started the School of Podcasting because at the same time they're saying membership sites are going to be big and so is podcasting. And I was like, ooh, what if we put those two things together? But the funny thing is that is the last thing you want to do with a podcast is I need to make money quickly because it was 2005. Everybody's like, do I need an iPod for that? Like, no, just the internet and speakers. And so that's why I was doing the School of Podcasting, but I also built websites for people. I played in a band. I did guitar lessons. You name it. I was doing it as a side hustle to put myself through college the second time. But yeah, so the beginning was, it took like 3 years before really things kind of kicked into gear. Because I would spend 15 minutes explaining what a podcast was, only to have somebody go, yeah, I don't want to do that. So so it took a while, and it was all a lot of nerds basically back then. You had to be kind of nerdy because there weren't the tools that there are now to start. But yeah, that's how I got going back in the day.
Oh my goodness, Dave. Like, okay, it sounds really funny now, but I'm sure it wasn't back then, right? But I mean, like with everything that we have now, right? You didn't have back then. And the fact that on Google, there was hardly any information on podcasting. Like, what made you think, this would be a good idea that there is something to podcasting. It's going to catch up eventually, because I'm sure a lot of people would have been like, no, there's nothing on the internet. This isn't a thing. It's not going to work out.
Yeah, that's a great question. Really, it came down to there were so many things that I'd seen that would, the internet would say, this is going to be the next big thing. And I go, oh, I should do that. And then I didn't. And then it would become this big thing. And it was just over and over and over. And it was the voicemail. When I got that voicemail, I was like, wait a minute, this is global. And I just saw the potential. And of course, it's funny, if you give a podcast to a teacher, he's like, I can help the world. If you give a podcast to a marketer, they're going to like, oh, I can sell everything to everyone. It depends on who's behind the microphone. But I saw it as like, oh, we're going to learn so much about different cultures, and I'll be able to hear from people from Africa, and all these things. Like, this is just going to be this great educational tool. And I was just like, you know what? I'm going to do this. I don't know what I'm doing, and I made so many mistakes along the way. Pricing, I priced it like next to nothing. And, I remember, and you need good friends that tell you, hey, like I remember once when I first opened, it was $5. I thought if I could get, 1,000 people to give me $5, $5,000, I'll definitely pay for college, blah, blah, blah. And my friend said, hey, I like the school of podcasting. Can you name anything on the internet worth anything for $5? And I was like, no. And he goes, yeah, exactly. He goes, you have a perception problem. He goes, and so I just kept raising my prices, and it was interesting because I went from 5, I think, to 10 to 20. And even at $20 a month, I would get people that would sign up because now they weren't going, well, that can't be any good, but they weren't doing anything. And my whole business plan was people will sign up, they'll start this podcast, it'll grow. And people are like, how did you learn how to podcast? Oh, go see Dave. Well, they were just paying me $20 for nothing. And so eventually I went up to 50, and that's when things really started to work. And over the years, I right now I'm actually pondering raising my prices because everybody and their brother is getting into podcasting, and they're charging thousands of dollars. And I'm like, I'm starting to look like the Walmart of podcasting. And I'm like, I might have to raise my prices, not because, I don't think it's, you always have that imposter syndrome. Like, well, I'm already making this much money, but I'm like, I know that if I'm way lower than everybody else, that's a problem.
Yes, that is. And that's so funny that you actually brought that up, because I feel like a lot of people have that like concern, right? Or the concern that if I put it up too high, then no one's going to buy, right? Yeah. And so that's part of the journey. And oh my goodness, like regards to podcasting, and the fact that you had someone from across the pond reach out to you was a big deal. Now, at this point, when you decided to do the School of Podcasting, it was still very, very new, right? How did you know that other people would be interested? And especially, as you said, a lot of people didn't even know what podcasting was.
I think it was just the fact that the feeling I had that when I realized that there's a guy across the pond listening to me, I just saw the potential. I was like, wait a minute. And there's no government regulations on what I can say. I can be as crazy. And in the early days of podcasting, it was all about flipping the bird to radio, because we hated radio, because in the States, it's horrible. And so you had people doing things that would never get on the radio. There was one, and they're still doing it, Yeast Radio. And the host is Madge Weinstein. And Madge cusses like a sailor, like just every other F and this and blah, 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 and just super outrageous. And then when I went to my first podcast event, I met Madge, and Madge is a dude. Like it's a character that this person is doing. Mm-hmm. There were all sorts of crazy things. People were doing, one guy used to record while he was in the bathroom. I'll leave it at that, in the morning. And it was called the Daily Download. And it was just, but again, it was a lot of 20-year-old nerds, because you had to be a nerd to figure out how to do an RSS feed, because we were hand coding them back then.
No way.
Yeah, it was, you were writing code to do that. And then finally there came a tool called Feed for All that I think is still around. Their website looks like it's 1995 if you go there. And I was doing my websites in Dreamweaver, and then somebody told me about WordPress. And WordPress made the RSS feed, and it just along the way, just another piece of the puzzle would kind of come in, like, oh, this makes it easier. Oh, this makes it easier.
Oh, so, okay. Now you've got me curious, Dave. You're gonna
Yeah.
be curious. Like you had to do everything from scratch when it came to podcasting back then, right?
Yeah.
So was it all the bits and pieces? Was it the website, the RSS feed? Like what did that look like back then?
Oh, it's crazy. I would build my website in Dreamweaver, which so I'd put it up, but it wasn't a podcast yet. So then I'd have to go into Feed for All, and uh, I forget where I was hosting my files originally, but I would upload it someplace, the MP3 file, and then I'd have to put that into the software and copy and paste the URL to the MP3 file, and then FTP that to the internet so that everybody looking at my feed. And then Libsyn came along, and that made things. They were the first media host, and I was like, okay, there's my feed problem taken care of. So and then I had stats because in the early days you had no idea. You could go in and look at how many times an MP3 file had been hit, but it was, now I know, especially back then, completely inaccurate because there are so many bots and stuff that hit your file. So yeah, it was weird because you had your website and then you had your podcast stuff. It wasn't really together. And then when WordPress came along and Libsyn came along, I was like, oh, okay, this is getting easier, And so I just, the whole time I'm like, if the world can see the potential, it's just going to take a while. It's just going to take a while. And I remember we would all get excited. I remember when the Maytag is a company here in the States that makes washers and dryers. And Maytag decided to start a podcast. We were all like, yes, not that we were that excited about washers and dryers, but it was a major company starting a podcast.
Yeah.
And I remember when Serial came along, that was one where I had like 5 people like, hey, you're the podcast guy. Have you heard this thing called Serial? And when I listened to it, I was like, oh, wow, this is really, really good. And then they did a parody of it on Saturday Night Live, which is this comedy staple that's been on TV forever. And I was like, wait a minute, they're parodying a podcast. Like we've just hit mainstream. Because if you don't know what a podcast is, that skit's not funny. And there were enough people that had listened to it. So yeah, it's been fun just to watch it slowly. And now, like every newscast is like, hey, thanks for watching. Check out our podcast. It's just like a normal thing now.
It is. And so it must blow your mind to see how far podcasting has come to right now, because there's so much help, so many different platforms out there to help everyone get a podcast up and running. Like there's no excuse not to do a podcast anymore.
Well, there is if you don't have anything to say. But for most people, there are a lot of people that are just, hitting the mic and like, well, I had bacon and eggs this morning. Like, okay, we don't really, or me and my friend are so funny, we're going to start a podcast. And then you realize you both laugh at each other because you have, 15 years of being a friend together. So when the guy says orange Gatorade and you're like, orange and the rest of the world is like, I don't know why orange Gatorade is funny, but they do. So that's, that's always fun. But yeah, I'm sitting here in front of this is a PodTrack P4. It's a little portable recorder that, like, I don't know, 5 years ago, I have one in my closet, was $800. And this thing does everything. It's kind of plasticky, so I wouldn't drop this too hard. It's under $200 and it will record. You can record up to 4 people. You can record somebody on Zoom. You can actually plug a phone into it. So if you have grandpa that's like, I don't have a computer, and you could have 2 in person, 1 on the internet, 1 on a phone, and they can all hear each other. You get separate tracks and a combined track. You can play little sound effects if you want to. It's less than $200.
Wow.
So that's the other thing that's just crazy, where the technology used to be, well, this is used in radio. It's $1,500, and you're like, yee. So that's the other thing that's changed.
Wow. So Dave, you must have seen a lot of people in the time that you've been doing podcasting, like make a lot of different mistakes, right? Whether it's not having the right technology or the fact that they're just getting on, pressing the record button and they've got nothing to say. But what are, I guess, the top 3 things that you constantly see people making mistakes in podcasting again and again?
Yeah, the big one is, why am I doing this? So if you're doing this to promote your business, somewhere in the show, you need to promote your business, and people get all salesy about that. They're not salesy. They get all like, ooh, I don't want to promote myself. And I'm like, but like I had somebody that was they did a podcast for about 6 months. I go, how's it doing? They're like, oh, it's actually growing. This is good. And they're like, I'm not getting any speaking gigs. And I go, I've known you for a year. You do speaking gigs? She never talked about it. Never talked about it in her podcast. And I go, how are people supposed to know you're a speaker if you don't mention, oh, I don't want to feel salesy? And I'm like, here's how you do it. It's very simple. I was talking to a bunch of high school kids in the Bronx this week, and this young man came up and asked me a question, and I thought that'd be a good topic for a podcast. I go, there you go. There's your commercial for I speak to high school kids. It doesn't have to be, hey, this Sunday, kind of thing. So, but you need to know your why, because if you don't know your why, you're going to get burned out. And so many people think I'm going to start a podcast and get advertising. And it's the numbers to get ads is lower than it used to be. I know at Libsyn, you need 2,000 downloads a month, but that's for programmatic ads, which don't pay very much at all. I mean, they're better than a poke in the eye, but most things are. Whereas if you're going to do the host read ads, you need about 10,000 downloads per episode. So that really doesn't work for most people.
Right.
And so consequently, when you start a podcast and you finally got up to 100 downloads, you're like, I need another, 1,600 a month to get ads. Well, then you burn out. So you need to know your why. And then you need to know your who. Because if I do a show for widows, let's say, well, there's still a big difference between, Joan, who lost her spouse at the age of 42 in a car wreck, and, Myrtle, who lost Harold at the age of 106 to natural causes. So when you do an episode about, hey, ladies, we're going to talk about getting back out there, like that's not going to resonate with Myrtle. It might. You never know. Myrtle's, a trip. Right. But anyway, so you need to know your who. And then the hard part of podcasting is you take the why and you take the who and you put it together, and that determines your what. What am I going to talk about to hold the attention of the who while moving them towards my why? And that's the part that most people don't do. And then the other thing that nobody does, and I get it, you just spent 14 hours putting out an episode and you just want to get it out there.
Right.
But writers have rough drafts. Athletes have preseason. Actors have dress rehearsals. But you've taken the very first thing you've ever completed and put it out to the public without getting, oh, crap. Opie Cunningham, Richie Cunningham is, what is that actor's name? Red hair, Ron Howard, famed director, right? Oscars, Emmys, he's got it all. Right. He did a movie about the Beatles, and he still sat in a movie theater and watched an audience watch the movie, because he knows when they're supposed to laugh and when they're supposed to cry and when they're supposed to gasp or whatever. And if they're not laughing and crying in the right spots, he's like, all right, back to the editing bay. And and podcasters don't do that. I mean, I'll give you an example it was last year, and I had a member of the School of Podcasting. She says, Dave, I love you. And I'm like, oh, that's always a weird way to start a conversation. She's like, but, and I go, what? She's like, you have a typo in your podcast. And I'm like, which one? I have a couple. And she goes, no, the School of Podcasting has a typo. And I go, in an episode? She goes, no, in the title. And I go, no way. So I look over, School of Podcasting, plan, launch, grow, monetize your show. I left out an E. And so I always tell people, you need another set of eyes because you're too close. Right. And I've had people that, the goal of the show is I want to sell more books. And then they never mention the book in the podcast. So you have to kind of know your why and know your who, and and it's always an ever-changing recipe. I always say your podcast is not a statue, it's a recipe. And the beautiful thing is you're the cook. So if you're like, well, should I do this? I don't know. Do you feel like it would work? Maybe. Okay, do it. Like there's no board of directors or somebody that's, the marketing department. In many cases, you are all of it. And you're like, I don't know. I was thinking about making the show about 10 minutes shorter. Okay, try that. See what happens. Does it, so. And then the other thing that people don't do is there's a great stat in Apple and in Spotify that you can see how far people listen. And we all love downloads because our ego just loves that. But I like to look at what percentage people listen to, because on occasion I will try something new. I'm like, I've never talked about this on the show. Not sure if it's going to resonate with the audience. And then you go in and you see where everything else was, 70, 85, 90% listen. And this one was, 62. You're like, yeah, that didn't work.
Right. Now, Dave, oh my goodness, with podcasting evolving so rapidly, right? Especially during the pandemic, like it just skyrocketed, right?
Yeah.
There's this whole new thing that you may have heard of called AI. Right? And so what do you think about AI when it comes to podcasting? Because a lot of people are, I guess, so they just want AI to do it all, right? To make it
Right.
easy for them. So what's your kind of suggestion, or how do you consider AI working with podcasting?
I like it. I use it a lot to brainstorm.
Okay.
Like I have done, like I'm getting ready to launch a new show, and I was like, here are 10 episode ideas that I've come up with my own brain. Give me another 20. And it was like, and I was like, you know what? 4 of those are good. Like the other 16 were like, So I use it to brainstorm sometime. The thing you have to be careful of, and I remember the School of Podcasting that found AI and just like dove into the deep end of the pool. And here's a guy who's been doing accounting for 30 years, has all these great stories and insights. And the show is called Ask Ralph. It's askralphpodcast.com. And he leaned so hard into AI that he took the Ralph out of Ask Ralph. And I'm like, dude, it's like you're fun and bubbly and blah, blah, blah. And I go, it sounds like you're now reading a script. And I go, it's okay to read a script as long as it doesn't sound like you're reading a script. And he's like, well, I did this. And then basically he just had AI just keep washing his own words. And I'm like, you kind of washed, like there's like he was talking about, I think it was failure. Sometimes you try things and you fail. And I go, dude, that's a great part to pull the vulnerability card and share a story where you failed and what you learned from it. And I go, instead, there was nothing. I go, there's no Ralph in the Ask Ralph pod. Now he has since changed that and it's much better. So I worry sometimes that, and I don't know about you, but every YouTube short right now looks identical. Like they all look identical. And it reminds me of, speaking of a personal story, right? My niece, when she was growing up, wanted to be different. So she decided to go goth. So, she dyes her hair black, everything's black, the whole 9 yards, because she wanted to stand out. And yet I was like, you do realize every kid in high school now has gone goth. Like you're trying to be different, but by doing so, you look like everybody else.
Right.
And so I saw this with audiograms when audiograms came out. And everybody's like, oh, I got to get a squiggly line. If I put a squiggly line in front of people, they'll click on it. And I'm like, well, maybe, and so that's the thing I'm worried about. And like last night, I was doing some work on my website, and I have this tool, and it said, "Hey, you have some pages that don't have enough words on it." So I took, I was using Cast Magic, so I took the episode, had it transcribed. I said, and then I took that transcription, threw it into ChatGPT. I said, write 600 words on this, and it did that. But the first thing I did was I had to read it, because the thing it's not that I don't like AI. It just, there are times, even though it's using my words, that it doesn't, like, I would never say that word. I forget what the word was. Intricities or some word I'd never heard of. And I'm like, I would never say that word because I can't even pronounce it. So I like it as a brainstorming tool and to think outside the box. I remember when I was doing a sales letter and in a video basically for it. And I said, what are the steps? These are the steps I'm taking for the sales video. What am I missing? And it actually came up with a couple. I was like, oh, that's a good point. So I use it. I always say it's artificial in like a not so much intelligence, but it's like it's like somebody working next to you. I don't want it to be my main source of content, but I want it to help me shape the stuff that I'm doing. One of the members of the School of Podcasting is a professor in Louisiana at a college, and he's the guy that does AI Goes to College. And he says, I love to put in stuff and go critique this. And you can have ChatGPT do that. So, but yeah, Cast Magic, there are a ton of these things. Swell, Capshow, and all those can be handy. The thing that I say, this is why Dave's not a huge fan. Dave has no problems getting ideas and typing. So by the time I take something out of a AI tool and beat it into death, same thing with transcripts. Transcripts are horrible to read. But by the time I beat it up and make it something to read, I could have just typed it. Absolutely. So when some people are like, wait, you don't use it like all the time? And I'm like, I don't have a problem with ideas and typing. So I don't always need to, but it's a lot of times, especially with titles, episode titles, I'll be like, here, give me 20 episode titles. And I'll be like, okay, none of these are good, but I like that. And I'll take this one and that one. And I kind of Frankenstein a title together. Then I'm like, I think that'll get people to click.
Absolutely. Yes, I pretty much do the same thing right now. One of the biggest things I always tell people about when it comes to podcasting is the whole SEO side of it. right? Which again is something that AI has trouble with. You cannot trust AI to do SEO, right? And so people say to me all the time, oh, I need to do show notes. What AI platform should I use? Should I use ChatGPT? And I'm like, oh my goodness, no, you do not rely on AI to do all of this stuff. You actually need a human being that knows SEO to do this, right? And so what are your thoughts on the whole podcasting and SEO and using AI?
Well, yeah, because you hit the nail on the head. AI is just, it gets you about 80% of the way there. But for me, I've had people, I on occasion, like I'm right now working on my website because my website took it just fell off the planet. And I
Oh,
was like I used to rank really high for really good keywords. And it turns out, long story short, I switched to a different SEO plugin. And somehow, I didn't read the manual. Somehow I had it set to not index my site. That's bad. Yeah. So things kind of dropped off. So, but when I have people look at my site, I've had people in the past, I'm like, hey, I need an SEO guy, make sure I'm not missing anything. And they'd all say the same thing. Wow, you've got a great authority rating or whatever that one thing is. They're like, what are you using to write this stuff? And I go, my brain. I write for people. I don't write now. Look, this doesn't mean you ignore SEO. Use headings, put your keywords in your headings and that whole night. But I write for people, and people go, should I write a blog or should I do a podcast? And I go, just do both. Treat every episode, make your show notes a blog post with a player at the top and then subscribe buttons at the bottom, because that way, it always drives me nuts when I see a business and you go to their website, you can't find their podcast, and they're sending them to your Buzzsprout page. And I'm like, Buzzsprout's getting all the SEO. Like, put that on your website. And then if your customers find this episode, they're like, oh, I've got to tell Cheryl about this, and they share it out, that's going to boost your SEO. If Google finds you in a search and they send people to your website, they click play and they sit there for 15 minutes, Google's like, that's funny. Every time I send somebody to Dave's site, they sit there for 15 minutes. It must be good. So yeah, use your website. We all get giddy. YouTube's the number 2 search engine. Yeah. And Google's number 1. What does it look at? Websites. But don't use a link tree for your website. There's no SEO in link tree,
Oh my goodness.
and so again, last night I had this thing transcribe an episode, and I just took it and was like, I'm always looking for where can I insert something personal about it, because that's what makes you you. The difference between, I know there are people now that they can click on a button in an RSS reader of some sort. It will trigger this to put it in Microsoft Word. It'll go to 11 Labs. They'll have a cloned version of their own voice, then send it to they click a couple buttons and a podcast spits out the other side. Now that's cool on a technical side, but on a content side, meh. Because for me, when I look at some of the stuff, it always seems like the advice is really high level. Like, hey, ChatGPT, how can I lose weight? Eat less and exercise more. Brilliant. I never would have thought of that. So that's where your boots on the ground, your hands-on experience, and anytime you can make a point with a personal story, that's where, we all talk about the know, like, and trust. Well, they get to know you. When Muhammad Ali died, when I grew up, he was like champ forever. And he was so much more than a boxer. And so when he died, I was really bummed. It's like one of my heroes. And so I do a podcast about podcasting. So I was like, yeah, but I want to talk about Muhammad Ali. This is bumming me out. So I was like, here are like 8 things every podcaster can learn from Muhammad Ali. A, always promoting. B, totally unique. Number 3, totally talented. Blah, blah, blah. So I was still talking about podcasting, but I was talking about Muhammad Ali. And I had people email me like, hey, he was my champ too, buddy. And that's when you're like, okay, cool. Once they email me, now I'm having a conversation. Hey, thanks so much for listening. I'm glad you liked the episode. Is there anything you'd like me to talk about in the future? And now you're building that relationship with your audience. So yeah, so anytime you can throw in a personal story, because ChatGPT can't do that.
Absolutely. It was so funny because last week, for the first time, I went to Italy into the snow mountains and went skiing for the very first time, and found out that I'm actually terrible at skiing, right? And was told by the instructor, like, this isn't for you. You shouldn't be doing this, right? Like, It was dreadful. The whole week, everything went wrong. Like, I bought my first snow boots, right? And not until I got to Italy and put them on for the first time, I realized they sold me 2 left feet.
Nice. There you go.
Like, it was just one of those weeks where like, everything went wrong. I don't know if you've heard of, have you seen the show Mr. Bean?
Not yet.
The UK, no? All right, he's like this comedian and everything
I know him.
goes
Yes.
wrong. Yeah. Basically, last week, I felt like Mr. Bean because everything was going wrong the entire week, right? Yeah. And I was like, I got to write something. I got to write about this, right? And turn the entire experience and everything that went wrong into how it works with podcasting, how it relates, right? Yeah. First time I went skiing, the first time you put an episode out, right? All the times that I fell skiing, the amount of times you fell when you do podcasting, like when you're absolutely right. When you add a personal story to everything, right? And you can put it in podcasting, whatever your business that you're doing, it gets so much more engagement, right, with your audience. So I absolutely love what you just said there and totally relate to it.
Yeah, I mean, I was asked to do stand-up comedy. I was like, I had to be the warm-up act, and I can make people chuckle, but I do not consider myself a comedian. And I only had to do 5 minutes. And I just remember I was about 2 minutes before I had to go on. My hands are all sweaty, and I'm like, I've rehearsed it, but I'm going way outside of my comfort zone. And I just told myself, okay, if this goes good, it'll be fun. If it goes bad, I will have a great story to tell, And it's like I always say, when you start a podcast, you either end up with a really good podcast or a really good story about that time when you started a podcast. So, and I'm always, anything I do, it's like, can this be used in an episode somewhere?
Yeah, absolutely. It's about getting your creative juices in flow, right? Because everything that you come across, good and bad, it's a way of getting your story and getting people to listen and having a lot more engagement rather than having ChatGPT write something very generic.
Exactly. And if you are, I have a few people that do financial shows, and we all get it. But when you're in the car and somebody's like, yes, if you take the dividends divided by the blah, 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 and it comes out to be like, when you're doing numbers, it's hard to really trigger the theater of the mind. The theater of the mind is just going, huh? Right. But if you can somehow put some, like, I was doing this and this cost this much, and, kind of explain it just to trigger that theater of the mind, that definitely comes in handy.
Definitely. Now, there's one more thing that I want to speak to you about regards to the future of podcasting, because we all know that there's so many podcasts out there that are now live streamed on social media. There's videos, video podcasting. People put it on YouTube. What are your thoughts on where podcast is going, and is it going the right way, do you think?
Yeah, it could be. There are great things that I'm super excited about. This is one of those I'm like, if people can see the potential. It's still, again, like the early days, it's very nerdy. And there's this thing called podcasting 2.0, because somebody said, hey, we should ditch this RSS technology and get the new technology. And one of the guys that invented podcasting, Adam Curry, was like, what if we just make it better? So that's what they're doing. And you now have the ability to have people stream Bitcoin to you. And I know as soon as I say Bitcoin, some people's eyes roll in the back of their head. I'm like, just think of it like fair tokens. And the longer they listen, the more you make, and they determine how much value you're giving them. So some people be like, $50, I got that. My couch cushions right here. And they throw it at other people, $50, like, I'm not really sure. I had a guy this week gave me $70. Just like, here's $70. And I was like, dang, all right, thank you, sir. So I want to see that, because the beauty of that is it's between you and your listener. So if you say the word booger and somebody goes, I am offended, you said booger, I'm going to go after your advertising and cancel you. You're like, I don't have any. Like, don't listen. So I like that side. The other thing that has me worried is, as more money is coming into it, people are trying, that's a strong word, but it's looking more and more like radio. And that is where I'm just going to stuff ads into it. And it's just math. People think I'm not a genie that's going to predict the future. But if X amount of podcasts, let's say it's 10 podcasts had the ability to accept ads, and you're like, okay, well, there's only so many places to advertise. So, those people, if they say, hey, no, you need to give me more, they had a little leverage because there were only so many places to go. Well, now the ability to have dynamic content in your podcast is like quadrupled. So if I go to give you money and you're like, yeah, it's not enough, I need more, I can just go to the next person and the next person, and eventually somebody's going to go, I'll take it. And so it's some people call that the race to the bottom. So I just worry, and I've already seen the price of advertising going down. It used to be around 25 to 30, and depending on your niche, you can still get that. But more and more, it's down around 20. Well, if you were getting, thousands of downloads and you just had your income cut by 20%, so what I'm seeing is some shows that only use advertising as income, they are adding more episodes. We used to be Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and now they're like, and sometimes Saturday. And they're also adding more ads to their show. So I'm just like, and radio in the US is 30% ads. It's horrendous. There are many times I turn it on in the car and I don't feel like connecting my phone. And I just go to channel to channel to channel. And it's either another AC/DC song that I don't need to hear ever again, Tom Petty or Led Zeppelin or whatever. And it's just ads. And I was like, oh, this is why podcasting took off, because it wasn't radio. People weren't talking like this with traffic and weather on the 10s. Okay. Right. It was real people talking about real stuff. So, and the thing is, the advertisers, which have big budgets, are, they're able to move the needle. They're able to say, well, we'll give you, this $1 million if you do this. And it's just kind of like, it's weird. And like the whole YouTube thing. Like YouTube is YouTube, and people are now calling it a podcast. And this is where we go, oh, Dave, he's the old curmudgeon. I go, no, it's not a podcast. Like Spotify, if you put a video on Spotify, it goes to Spotify. Every place else, they give you the audio. If you put a quote podcast, if I go into YouTube and go, I dub thee a podcast, it goes to YouTube and YouTube Music. It's not a podcast. We used to call that a YouTuber. You'd ask a 9-year-old, what do you want to be when you grow up? And they go, a YouTuber. And like, now it's a podcast. So they've kind of, whereas if you actually have a video podcast, which has been around since 2005, it can go to every place that runs, video, but not all apps do. So that's the part that is kind of weird. And I think the reason YouTube did that is all this money is supposed to be coming into podcasting. So YouTube went, how can we get some of that? Oh, we're a podcast. Come on, bring that money over here too. Right. So that's the part that I find a little confusing at times. So, hopefully in the end, I want to see that independent podcast spirit goes, I'm going to do this because I want to do it. And I want to talk about this and maybe not worry about making money. I always tell people, I wrote a book on podcast monetization. I'm like, you don't have to make money with your podcast. In some cases, it's the best $7 therapy there is, just getting the stuff out there. So I know it's going to continue to grow because I don't know. I don't know about in the UK, but in the US, every show is either a lawyer show, a doctor show, and now we have a couple firefighter shows, but they're all, or some sort of reality show where we kick people off. And I'm just like, there's no real creativity in media. So when you come across a podcast and they're talking about, raising children when you're an interracial parent, you're like, whoa, nobody's talking about this on mainstream. This is exactly what I want. Have you been reading my diary? Then you have real audiences that really get engaged.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh my goodness. We have covered so many different things on this show, Dave. But I've got one more. I know I said I had one more last question, but I've got another question because of something that you brought up, right? And it's a little bit controversial in the podcasting industry, right?
I'm excited.
Now, there's people are saying, what is a podcast? What isn't a podcast? If it's just on YouTube, like you mentioned, right? If it doesn't have an RSS feed, it's not a podcast, right? What are your thoughts? Because I'm very much like, if it doesn't have an RSS feed, it's not a podcast at all. It's got to have an RSS feed.
Right. So I'm with you on that. And here's the thing. So when people started calling YouTube a podcast, I go, it's not a podcast. I have a thing on my YouTube channel that says, please quit calling YouTube a podcast. It's a YouTube thing. And people literally like, oh, it's Dave. He's the old guy. Just, that's just whatever. And I'm like, but where it ruins it now is when you hear somebody say video podcast on YouTube, that's a YouTube video. Yes. And I hear reports where they say, well, according to this reports, more people are consuming video podcasts on YouTube. And I'm like, so if I take you just said more people are watching YouTube on YouTube. I go, come on, that's insane. And so that was my biggest worry. I said, look, I work in the communication field, right? Education, words are my jam, and you're changing the definition of the word podcast. It's like country music in the US used to be womp, womp, womp. My dog is dead, mom's in jail, that whole 9 yards. My dad grew up listening to that stuff. And it wasn't that popular because, well, it was country music. Now, if you listen to country music, it sounds like AC/DC with a banjo in the background, maybe a fiddle. And so the term country music is not what it was 20 years ago. And what do you know? Country music is now the #1 selling genre because it's pop. It really is. It's pop music with a fiddle and somebody singing with a Southern accent about mama in jail, but I'm like, you change the definition, you get a different, report. So when you change the definition of podcasting, now it's like, well, YouTube's the #1 way people discover podcasts. And I'm like, actually, what you're saying is YouTube is the #1 way people discover YouTubers. That's silly. So, and I get it. I'm not, YouTube is a great discovery tool, and you should probably have something on there that says, oh, by the way, for more information, go listen to my podcast. So yeah, but you will be, and that's where it's a great example of, I have people go that literally will go, it's just let him say it. It's just Dave. He's old. He's an OG. And I'm just like, but it's true. It's true.
Yes, but that's the thing. The way I would see it, I wouldn't see it like, he's an OG, like let him say it. I'd be like, well, he's known that, he's seen the podcast evolution. Like, if anything, better than most people, right? And I'm so glad you and I are on the same page when it comes to that. So that's awesome.
Have you heard about Listen Notes?
Yes.
Yes, Listen Notes drive me nuts because people go, oh, like, I am a top 0.5 podcaster according to Listen Notes. But what people don't realize is you are being ranked against every podcast ever. So that WordPress podcast from 2007, congratulations, you're better than them. And I'm like, so I see people, and it's just, I need to feed my ego, so I need something to put on my one sheet that I'm a top 10% podcaster or whatever. And I'm like, yeah, but that's okay. So, and that's
There's another thing that's very controversial as well, right, in the podcasting world, and that is downloads, right? Because a lot of people, and you mentioned this as well, like, maybe not focus too much on the downloads, right? If you need sponsors, then people look at that, but to me, I'm like, downloads, I used to focus on this a lot when I first started podcasting, because you get told, everything out there, you got to focus on it to make money. You got to get downloads. You got to get this. You got to, right? And then I learned, but you don't know who these people are. There could be bots, right? You don't know their details. You don't know it. And so, is downloads really that important? I didn't think it was, right? Go ahead.
Well, it is if you're getting into advertising, but again, less than 10%. But that doesn't mean you can't have advertising. Like, I've had advertisers on the School of Podcasting, but it was for microphones. Right. You know what I mean? It's like, it totally fit my audience. And because of that, they paid more. It's like, oh, if you want podcasters, I got about a couple thousand listening to the show. It's going to cost you X amount of money. Yeah. And so it's, just because you don't have 10,000 downloads doesn't mean you have to, you're never, I can't spit it out. But if you have a niche audience, you can still have sponsors. So keep that in mind. It's just the #1 way to make money with your podcast. Hands down. I did a book about it. I interviewed about 70 podcasters selling your own stuff, your own services, your books, your courses, your services, your consulting, whatever it is, hands down, is the most profitable way. Because again, when you show up on a regular basis, every week or every Tuesday or whatever it is, you're seen as reliable. When you share those personal stories, they get to know you. And when you deliver valuable content, they like you. So there's the know, like, and trust. And you go, oh, by the way, I got a new book coming out. Okay, well, I like this guy. I'm going to go buy it. She's awesome. I'm going to go take her course.
Right.
And the amount of money you make from that, when you're getting paid, in some cases, 0.004 cents a download. How many downloads you have to get to, make $100? A lot.
Yeah.
So, and I always sound like I'm anti-ad. I'm like, no. If you're getting, 100,000 downloads, by all means, flip that switch. But if you're not, making your, and then there's Patreon and, all the crowdfunding and stuff like that. But the number one way is selling your own stuff.
Absolutely. Absolutely. See, I'm one of those that like to look at, people that are actually engaging, say, on social media when you put caption videos out, right? People that are actually commenting, people that stop you when you're going to an event and be like, oh my goodness, I listened to your episode with Dave Jackson. That was awesome. Like, that means more to me, right, than getting 100,000, 1 million downloads, because I don't know who half of those people are, if they're even real people.
Right. And you have no idea, which is kind of sad in a way, what impact you have on people. Because a lot of times they don't feel back. But I had a guy email me and said, hey, I heard your podcast where you said sometimes having a podcast can give you a purpose in life. And he goes, my best friend of like 20 years had been killed in a car wreck. I lost my job of 20 years and I was pretty sure I had cancer and I was going to kill myself on Halloween. But I heard your podcast and I decided I would start a podcast, and I just want to let you know, I credit you with saving my life. And it's hard to make Dave Jackson speechless, but I was like, wait, what? Like, and then when I've told that story to a few different events, and that's not uncommon. So you really don't know the impact you're having on people, but it's kind of cool. When I travel around, a lot of times I'll be like, hey, I'm going to be in, nowhere, Mississippi. And I'll have somebody like, oh, that's my town. Like, can I take you to dinner? And I'm like, sure. And I just tell people, hey, if I have to, get murdered in Mississippi, it was Sharon. I don't know this person, but I'm going to go to dinner with them. So the impact is, it's great to make money with your podcast, but it's also great to find like-minded people and get, I remember once, have you ever had to put together furniture? Like, slab A into tab B.
Yep.
And I'm on the floor and I'm just like, I'm hating life right now. And I was like, wait, hold on a second. And I turned on a podcast and it was my friend Brian. And all of a sudden I wasn't alone. And that to me is priceless. So.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh my goodness, Dave. So many golden nuggets in such a short amount of time. I feel like I can speak to you for the entire day, right, about podcasting, but we won't do that. But I know at this point, people are probably thinking, oh my goodness, I need to connect with Dave. I need to learn more about what he does, how he does it. So where can they go to connect with you?
Yeah, my flagship, I guess you could say, website is schoolofpodcasting.com, but I do a whole lot of shows on podcasting. And so if you want to see all things Dave, go to powerofpodcasting.com, which is the only time I will ever use a somewhat link tree kind of site. Most everything's at schoolofpodcasting.com, but I have a bunch of shows, and that's at powerofpodcasting.com.
Fantastic. Oh my goodness. Dave, thanks so much for coming onto the show and sharing your world of wisdom about podcasting. It's been awesome.
Thanks so much. Had a great time.
Thanks for listening to Make Your Mark podcast at www.makeyourmarkpodcast.com. Make sure you hit that subscribe button so you get this and every other episode that comes out. We have lots of great stuff coming, so make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss it. And thank you in advance for all the reviews and comments. I appreciate it so much, and I look forward to serving you in next week's episode.